Welcome to our first annual capstone to the graduate student series, Expose Yourself. Thank you for taking a risk. Given the risque title of the event, I promise nothing untoward is going to happen in the next hour. Expose Yourself is a series that happens throughout the year here on campus, and it's an effort to showcase graduate work across the disciplines. So you hear a lot about interdisciplinary work at the University of Chicago, and we're trying our best to give current students an opportunity to both showcase that work to people outside of their current departments and also meet each other in somewhat of a social setting. So to give you an example, we kicked off the series this year with a lab crawl throughout the physical sciences and biological sciences labs over near the medical campus. We followed that up with a special showing of the court theater production of the play Proof, and a discussion with the cast and crew of that play. And then we finished off the year with a series of lectures at Special Collections, which is, has anybody been to Mansueto and Special Collections yet? Yeah, it's pretty awesome if you haven't seen it. So it's just an opportunity to get students around campus and to showcase the work that they're doing. So I'd like to thank you, especially on behalf of Graduate Student Affairs and the Deputy Provost for Graduate Education, Debbie Nelson. And I think that is all that I have in the way of kind of the formal business. In the way of graduate student events, we hope that you'll join us for a glass of wine and some cheese at the end of this. That's kind of the way that all graduate student events here happen. And it's also my job to just introduce our four speakers. So we'll lead it off with Ivo Peters. Ivo's a postdoc, actually, and he's studied applied physics at the University of Twente? Twente. In the Netherlands. He minored in civil engineering on the subject of water management. During his studies, he spent a few months in Paris at the laboratory MSc of the Université Paris 7. That's my best French possible. Working with Laurent Limont on the contact line dynamics of sliding droplets. As a graduate student, he worked in the physics of fluids group at the University of Twente on various projects, all involving singularities and fluid flows. After obtaining his PhD, he moved to the University of Chicago in September of 2012, where he's working now as a postdoc in the group of Heinrich Jaeger on the dynamics of dense suspensions. I promise all of that will make a lot more sense when Ivo starts talking about it. We'll follow with Meredith Aska McBride, who's a third-year doctoral candidate in ethnomusicology in the Department of Music, where her research and teaching focus on urban ethnomusicology. Her dissertation is entitled City with a Lifted Head Singing, Music Education and the Cultural Policy in Chicago. Her past research has primarily focused on urban Jewish musical practice, in particular Jewish hip-hop and Jewish liturgical music. She's currently completing a long-standing project on white flight and Jewish music in Philadelphia. And we'll have Kai Parker, who's a PhD student in the Department of History, researching African-American religious culture in mid-20th century Chicago. Kai is also an archivist at the Vivian G. Harsh Research Collection of Afro-American History and Literature. And finally, Natalia Gonzalez, who's originally from Denver. She completed her undergraduate degrees at Williams in Massachusetts, where she earned degrees in both biology and religion. She spent a year studying house finches in a behavioral ecology lab at Virginia Tech before entering as a PhD student in the Department of Human Genetics at UChicago. Natalia now works in a lab that uses both mice and men to study the genetic basis of behaviors such as fear, anxiety, and drug abuse. So you'll see the diversity of projects happening all over campus, which we think is so incredible. And we'll save a lot of time for questions. And again, I hope you'll join us at the end for some food and drink. When you have a question at the end, there's a mic that's going to go around. So just wait, because we're going to film the proceedings. So without further ado, Ivo Peters.
Thank you. So my name is Ivo, and I will talk about dense suspensions, and especially when do they splash. So I will not start with explaining what dense suspensions are, but here you see one splashing. I will start with a short history about the research in splashing. So I'm looking at splashing. So I will start with the history of droplet splashing. So if you have a liquid droplet, you let it fall on the surface, it seems like a very easy problem. At least you can do it yourself in your kitchen if you want. But by now we have found out that it's actually an extremely complicated problem. And we keep seeing things that you don't expect. And the reason that you don't expect them is because normally you do not see them. If you take a droplet, you let it fall on something, you barely see anything. So more than 100 years ago, there was one guy, Worthington, and he tried to solve this problem. So I cannot see what's happening. So what he did, he was going to sit in a dark room, extremely dark, and he had a device which made a flash exactly the right moment. So he would let a droplet fall, and then you would see a flash. And so basically what he sees is all within this flash, which is very short. And then he would repeat it many, many times until he had a kind of a picture in his head. So this is how it looks like when this droplet hits the surface. And once he had this picture in his head, he would draw this, and this is one of his drawings that he made. So now I'm going to make a huge jump forward to 2011. So right now we can take pictures. We have cameras, which makes things a lot easier. And we not just have cameras, we have high-speed cameras. So right now there are cameras around who can make more than 1 million frames per second. So you can imagine if you blink your eye, that's about 1/10 of a second. And this camera can record 100,000 frames in this moment that you close your eye when you're blinking. So if you would play that back on a normal speed, then you can watch a movie of 1 hour in the time that you blink your eye. That much material can you gain in such a short time. So if you look at a droplet splashing with a high-speed camera, and you see that. So here's the droplet. This is a reflection of the droplet, and here's the glass plate. And watch it falls. And you see this. So I'm not going to explain everything that you see in here, but you can see there's a lot of different things going on. And what's most important, you don't see anything of this if you do the experiment and just look at it. You just see the droplet pop and it's gone. You see the end result. But you don't see anything of what happens in between. And this is very important. So right now we have high-speed cameras. And it's like looking at something with a microscope. You can see things that you usually would not see at all. So apart from that, it's a very interesting problem to do research on. It has a lot of applications. What we see here is an inkjet printer. An inkjet printer shoots droplets at a surface. And one of the things you want if you want to make such a nice picture is you don't want these droplets to splash. As you can imagine, you can never make such a nice print if all your droplets are going to splash all over the place. So that's how we use water or liquid droplets, and we don't want them to splash in some applications. However, right now we also have 3D printers. In a 3D printer, you do not use liquids to print your project. You use different materials. And also in these cases, you want to print very fast. And again, if you would shoot material at the surface and it would splash, then you can never make these kinds of nice objects. So these examples are now like state-of-the-art printing applications. But we also want to look at what's going to happen in the future. So in 3D printing, there is a huge development. So this is one example where they actually use sugar to make a print. And they're basically trying all kinds of different materials to use as a printing medium. And they're also making larger and larger objects. So you see, this is a future idea. There's a guy here, and they are printing a house. So you just make a model in your computer, and you print a house anywhere you want. Well, in all these, so there are many different materials that we want to start using for printing, and every time we want to do it as fast as possible and with high resolutions. And in all these applications, you don't want these things to splash. So we want to know if you shoot material at something, what happens to it, and how can we prevent it from breaking apart or splashing and things like that. So I investigate this with a very simple experiment. So I have a tube, and from this tube I drop a suspension. And a suspension is just water with particles in there, solid particles. So we have a liquid phase and a solid phase. So we kind of know how a liquid works, kind of know how a solid works, but if you put them together, it's kind of one big mystery how it actually behaves. So it can stay together as one drop, or if you let it drop a bit faster, and it falls apart. So this is the same movie that was on my title slide. So we want to explain how this works. So we do not know how a suspension actually works. Is it a liquid or is it a solid? But the approach that many people use now is that they say, well, it's a liquid, but we're going to change the properties of the liquid a little bit because we have added particles to this. So they are trying to explain it in first way as a liquid. And what we know of splashing of liquids is that surface tension is very important. I have a small example. So I have here two glasses. In this one, there are a couple of droplets of water in there. And I can simply keep all this upside down and the water will stay in there. Water droplet will not fall out. So I think you all know what will happen if I turn this one upside down. So I will not do it. But there is an important lesson which we can learn from this. And that's this one. The bigger your droplet, the easier it will splash. The surface tension is very effective if things are small. So the small droplet, surface tension is perfectly able to keep that in your glass. But if you have a full glass, then surface tension cannot work anymore. Same as for this guy. This guy can walk on water due to surface tension. I cannot walk on water, and that's simply because I'm too big for that. So if we have a droplet and it splashes, what can we do to prevent it from splashing? It's simply we make it smaller. So you use a smaller droplet and will not splash anymore. This works. But if we can treat a suspension as a liquid, then the same thing would hold. Because also the suspension is being held together by surface tension. So I go into the lab and I test this. So here's my suspension droplet. I'm looking from below now, so this is a bit different. So it's coming towards you. This one splashes. Okay. So we do the next step. We take a smaller one. This one still splashes. Okay, maybe I have to make it even smaller. No, still the same thing happens. So I made a mistake somewhere. I don't know what happened, but apparently size doesn't matter anymore. But, well, I just told you that surface tension is very important and it works better at small scales. And surface tension is really the thing which is holding this together. So we solved this mystery by this method. So it's not the size of the drop which is important, but it's the size of the particles which are in this drop which are important. So this was what I told you before, the bigger the droplet, but it's actually the bigger the particles, the easier it will splash. At least that's my new guess. And of course, we can try again. So this is one droplet, it splashes, particles flying away. I have here a same size droplet, only with smaller particles in there. And this one doesn't. So we can actually calculate and make a nice prediction of when these things will splash. So this is my prediction. Here we have increasing particle size. This is increasing impact speed. And there are two regions in this plot. This whole gray region is where we don't expect a splash, and this other region is where we expect a splash. And we can just use all kinds of different particle sizes and materials, and then we find a transition. So here's one transition, and we basically fill up this graph on all kinds of different points. And it agrees. So now we know that if we want to prevent splashing, we have to use smaller particles. Now, the next step, so if you are looking in the real world and you have suspensions, then it's not always like this. So these are my experimental droplets, big particles, small particles. But in the real world, they might be combined. And that's the second approach to that, is just to combine these two. And we make a bimodal suspension, which looks like this. So you see there are small and big particles in there. And I just told you that big particles are easier to splash than small ones. So if we would drop this one, then we would expect that the big ones are flying out. So I did this test. And again, I was completely surprised. There are big particles in here, but the ones which are flying out are the very tiny ones. So again, this is not what surface tension would tell me. It tells me the bigger the things are, the easier the splash, not the smaller. So this again works completely the other way around. Well, to answer this, we have to look at what really happens inside the suspension. And that's that there are collisions between the particles. So this is one very famous physics experiment. You have a basketball, this guy holds a tennis ball on top of that, and he drops them together. And then we see this. The tennis ball shoots away like crazy. So the big particles, they are able to kick the small ones out. I'll play this movie again. Just see if I can find this. So you can imagine this suspension droplet as one droplet with all kinds of big basketballs in there and small tennis balls. And they're colliding with each other, and the big ones, they kick the small ones out. So to conclude this talk, so we have predict the splashing of dense suspension droplets, and we know that the size of the particles is important. And this is completely different than what people thought before. They were approximating it as a liquid, so the size of the droplet is important, and we make some corrections for the addition of particles. Well, we found out that it actually works completely different. So it has nothing to do, almost nothing to do anymore with a liquid droplet. And the reason that it is like this is because we have these collisions. And in a liquid, you don't care about the collisions between particles. But in suspensions, you have to care about those things. And that's also how we can explain the second weird behavior that the small ones are flying out. Thank you.
We'll do questions at the end.
All right.
We'll do questions at the end.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Just close it. Okay. I've been a violinist since I was 5 and a music teacher since I was 14. My very first teaching job when I was in high school was as a teaching intern for the Milwaukee Youth Symphony Orchestra's Progressions program, which was intended to address the lack of diversity within the youth orchestra by providing free lessons to low-income children of color from the Milwaukee Public Schools, with the goal of having these students eventually participate in the orchestra program. Although the Milwaukee Youth Symphony originally intended Progressions simply as a way to improve the technical musical ability of low-income students of color as a means of increasing diversity within its ranks, the program readily lent itself to other discourses. program administrators, educators, parents, and donors regularly invoked the power of music education to instill self-discipline, perseverance, and collaborative skills. In this way, music education was seen as instrumental in achieving broader social goals and solving some of the problems plaguing this particular struggling urban school system. Similarly, in my work as a strings teacher in Camden, New Jersey, and on the south side of Chicago, I have seen the power of music education to effect personal and social change invoked time and again. Thus, I've chosen to focus my dissertation research on this very topic. My project is entitled, as you heard, City with Lifted Head Singing, Music Education and Cultural Policy in Chicago, named after a line from the famous Carl Sandburg poem. I'll be beginning my field research this summer, so I'm excited to share the framework of my research with you here today. With this project, I take a step back and ask, what are the stakes of urban arts education today? What are we asking arts education, and specifically music education, which is my realm of expertise, to achieve for our cities and our children? Why do we seem to believe that education in the arts has a formative and disciplining power that, say, math or physical education does not? And why are music and arts education seemingly so difficult to justify as valuable for their own sake in the education reform debates? Urban arts education in the public schools has certainly been in a dismal state for several decades. After years of federal, local, and state disinvestment in public school arts education, the 2008 Federal Survey of Public Participation in the Arts reported that less than half of 18-year-olds across the country had had any type of arts education as children. More locally, in the mid-2000s, the Chicago Public Schools were only able to budget one full-time art teacher per 1,500 children. In 2001, this meant that the average elementary school student in Chicago received less than 45 minutes of art or music per week. And actually, because that's an average statistic, what it means is that some kids were getting regular art and music classes and most kids were getting nothing. The statistics here are shocking enough on their own, but it gets even worse when we break it down further. The 2008 survey found that among white children across the United States, the rate of childhood arts education exposure declined only 5% between 1982 and 2008. However, African American children suffered a 49% decline in arts education access during this time period, and Hispanic children 40%. These horrible statistics reflect the fact that because children of color are more likely to live in cities, to be poor or working class, and to lack the means to access private arts education, they have borne most of the massive disinvestment in urban public school arts education. Indeed, Chicago's music education landscape reflects a city divided between haves and have-nots, where those who rely on public institutions to access music education are often unable to do so, but those with disposable income at nearly any level can spend it on high-quality private music education opportunities of many kinds. A third way between public and private is increasingly prevalent as well, the presence of community partnership programs between arts nonprofits and public charter and Catholic schools. In these programs, funded by schools' discretionary budgets and/or grants and donations, teaching artists are brought in either to supplement extant music programs or to provide a music education opportunity where none previously existed. Some of you may have heard of the City of Chicago Cultural Plan. In 2011 and 2012, Mayor Rahm Emanuel's administration spearheaded a cultural planning process intended to create a comprehensive cultural plan for the city that would then be implemented over the short, mid, and long term as resources permitted. Because increasing access to arts education was identified as a high priority during this process, the Chicago Public Schools created their own 2012 Arts Education Plan in addition to the arts education aspects of the broader cultural plan. These projects have renewed attention to arts education and will certainly provide more funding and logistical support than has been the case in recent years, but they certainly raise as many questions as they answer about the future of arts education in Chicago. Over the next 2 years, my project will explore the intersection of music education and cultural policy in Chicago. As I said before, what are we asking arts education, and specifically here music education, to achieve for our cities and for our children? Through field research with at least 4 music and arts education programs, numerous interviews, historical research, and policy analysis, I want to understand first how policy interventions and the realities of the contemporary city have shaped the landscape of music education as it currently stands. Second, I seek to understand how and why students and families access and participate in music education, and how educators and arts administrators shape and manage their careers in this field. Third, I will track the impact of the 2012 Cultural Plan and Arts Education Plan on the programs with which I'll be working, and seek to understand how these new policy initiatives will affect music education in Chicago. Finally, I will connect my ethnographic findings with the growing discourse on citizenship in the social sciences and humanities. Because so many music education programs are directed both at teaching musicianship skills and at effecting personal or community level change, I believe that connecting my field research with emerging concepts of local citizenship will illuminate both the music programs themselves and provide a new dimension to the emerging academic discourse. Music education programs are increasingly, along with teaching basic musicianship, being asked to produce new kinds of people. Some of the buzzwords are self-discipline, goal-oriented, collaborative, or even up-and-coming members of the creative class, and to solve various kinds of urban problems. For example, one of the programs with which I'll be working is primarily funded through anti-gang violence initiatives, with the assumption that the social bonds and personal qualities formed through participation in a symphonic orchestra will provide students with an alternative to joining a gang. In Chicago's urban setting, it is abundantly clear that music education is no longer, if it ever was, simply about learning to play the piano or trumpet, but rather about reshaping people and communities through artistic and pedagogical processes. I believe in the transformative personal and social potential of music as much as the next violin teacher. But as a city, and increasingly as a country, we are asking so incredibly much of music education, and it behooves us to examine this critically, to understand our underlying assumptions, and to think deeply about the ways in which music and arts education interact with other urban issues and initiatives. Our potential for making change is sorely limited if we do not understand exactly what is happening, how, and why. As this project unfolds, I am particularly excited to bridge the worlds of academia, arts education, and policymaking, and hope that my research will have a pragmatic impact in the short and long term. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, AJ, for putting this together, and thanks, Meredith, for suggesting that I be on this panel. So my research is primarily in 20th century African-American history, and specifically I focus on mid-20th century Black Chicago religious history. And the problem that I'm focusing on is investigating the ways in which Black Chicago served as the principal site for a reorientation of Black religion in the early 1930s. In the early 1930s, Black Chicago fostered two developments generally seen as unrelated to each other. The first development was the rise and transformation of African American identification with Ethiopia, particularly around the years in which Mussolini and Fascist Italy was beginning to invade Ethiopia in the early and mid-1930s. And this provoked a wide variety of African American identifications with Ethiopia, politically, culturally, and spiritually. And the second development is the rise of gospel music. Thank you. The second development is the rise of gospel music in Black Chicago. And these developments together shared an interest in shifting the focus of African American identity and cultural practice from the dead, the killed, the perpetual sufferer, and the lynched, often represented in African American consciousness and cultural practice by the trope of the crucified Jesus, to the survivors of the deceased who experienced the trauma of loss, yet still managed to struggle against various levels of oppression. And this was represented by the community surrounding Jesus, and particularly by Simon of Cyrene. In the Bible, Simon of Cyrene is the North African who is forced by the Romans to bear Jesus' cross to the site of his crucifixion on Calvary Hill. So through this shift in consciousness from Jesus to the community surrounding Jesus, and particularly to Simon of Cyrene, Black Chicago religious culture encouraged African Americans to confront the traumas of the 1930s, which included lynching, racism, the Great Depression, and Italy's imperialist war on Ethiopia, with a renewed sense of communal pride. So there are a lot of different aspects of Ethiopianism that I explore in my research. Today I will just talk about Simon of Cyrene, and then I'll talk a little bit about gospel music. So the proliferation of the trope of Simon of Cyrene in Black Chicago was integral to the developments in Black consciousness that gave rise to this new sense of communal fortitude and a rising sense of Black internationalism in the 1930s. In all three synoptic Gospels, Simon, from the town of Cyrene in present-day Libya, is compelled by the Romans to bear Jesus' cross to the site of the crucifixion on Calvary Hill. Simon of Cyrene's presence in the Bible provided an ancient African lineage for Black Christians, and this showed for Black Christians that rather than Christianity being, in a sense, the white man's religion that is foisted upon African Americans during the crucible of slavery, Christianity was deeply embedded in Black culture and Black history and Black religious consciousness, and therefore wasn't simply the white man's religion. And African Americans identified with Simon of Cyrene because, like the biblical African conscript, African American laborers bore the cross not only metaphorically, but physically in the form of lashings and brandings, often on their backs. And this provoked an intense level of identification with the trope of Simon of Cyrene. Some scholars have feared that identifying with Simon of Cyrene often led African Americans to political quiescence, to accepting that they would always be laboring in the service of others rather than working for themselves, or that they would always have to sacrifice themselves in some sense in order to advance the American project, which continued to hold them as second-class citizens despite their strivings and their toil. However, my argument is that in Chicago, African Americans embraced the trope of Cyrene not to imagine themselves as sacrifices upon the altar of, say, American democracy or as underpaid laborers in the American economy, but rather they used Simon of Cyrene to imagine themselves working towards and ultimately achieving new futures free of the seemingly insurmountable racism and economic deprivation that marked the 1930s. Furthermore, Simon of Cyrene enabled Black Chicagoans to imagine themselves as world citizens, despite facing such hardships within the boundaries of their own segregated city. And one example of the trope of Simon of Cyrene that I will talk about is this painting by this painter, William Edward Scott, who was based in Black Chicago throughout the first half of the 20th century. And in 1934, he painted a work called The Cross of Calvary, which he painted for a funeral parlor. And the purpose of his painting, which essentially depicted a Black Simon of Cyrene figure bearing the cross for a white European Jesus figure, was to show African Americans that they should be like Simon of Cyrene and that they should strive to, as he put it, do their part for the betterment of the world. And for Scott, this symbolized the modern Negro. So here he's combining this biblical trope with the sense of African and Afro-diasporic modernity. And it's significant that the painting was for a funeral parlor, in that it showed that the trope of Simon of Cyrene was often centered around, even in the personal devastation wrought by the trauma of death, African Americans still needed to think about striving to do the most that they could towards helping other African Americans and other Black people and other people throughout the world. And this kind of consciousness fit in with the rest of Scott's political consciousness, and Scott ultimately became deeply invested in the attempt of African Americans to aid Ethiopia during Mussolini's attack. And so in the future, he paints paintings such as Aid to Ethiopia, which depict African American pilots reporting for duty in the Ethiopian Air Force. So in this sense, Simon of Cyrene really embodied this idea that even with all the traumas and all the economic deprivations of the early 1930s, African Americans still need to think about how they can affect the world stage, how they can really play their part within the diaspora and within world politics. And connected to this rise in the trope of Simon of Cyrene was this rise of modern gospel music in Black Chicago. And this was centered around Thomas Dorsey, who became the most prominent gospel composer. And Thomas Dorsey's story of how he kind of came to prominence in Black Chicago was also tied to the response to death. And for Thomas Dorsey, he migrated to Chicago, and by the late 1920s, he was one of the most famous blues composers, and he was making a lot of money from his blues compositions, and he was very happy about this because he could then provide for his wife and for his child, whom he and his wife were expecting soon. But then in 1932, while he was on tour with his group, his wife became very ill while she was pregnant. And ultimately, she died during childbirth, and then their newborn baby son died later that night. And this really devastated Dorsey, and he went into a deep depression. And in his despondency, after he witnessed the shared casket that his wife and his newborn child were laying in a Black Chicago church, Pilgrim Baptist Church, he goes to Poor Old Beauty College, and he sits down at the piano, and he begins to plunk out the tune, the hymn, "Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone?" And ultimately, from constantly playing this tune and thinking about new ways of rendering it, he develops what becomes his signature song, "Take My Hand, Precious Lord." And through this song, he was able to express not only the grief that he felt at the loss of his family, but also the sense that he wasn't just going to wallow in his grief, but he was going to continue to carry on and live his life and fulfill some of his dreams, despite the utter devastation that he felt at the loss of his wife and his child. And so "Precious Lord" quickly becomes perhaps the most popular gospel song of the entire middle of the 20th century in African American culture, and it becomes particularly a very popular song to sing during funerals. And most famously, it was sung by Mahalia Jackson at Martin Luther King's funeral in 1968. So in this way, gospel music became tied to this sense that rather than wallowing in the pain and trauma of death and of sudden deprivation, African Americans should confront this challenge of trauma, but also realize that they can rise beyond it. And so this became a story that Thomas Dorsey told constantly in interviews and on recordings. So the trope of Simon and Cyrene and the rise of gospel music were tied together in this effort to imagine these new futures, new identifications for African Americans. And I was really fascinated by this research and this topic, particularly because today there's such a wide perception that Chicago in many ways has become the city of death for African Americans, both in terms of the end of a certain kind of dream of a widely successful African American urbanization in the North, and then more particularly in terms of the proliferation of violence in Chicago. And even when I was started to put this project together and think about a title for this project, I was bouncing off different titles to a friend who doesn't live in Chicago. And one title I was thinking about was Spiritual Culture and Social Struggle in Black Chicago. And the first thing he said was, wow, Chicago could certainly use some spiritual culture these days, huh? And it really captured the sense that Chicago had really gained this particular reputation within Black consciousness in the present day. So I was really fascinated by thinking about ways in which African Americans, even in the midst of death, poverty, and the deferred dreams of the Great Depression, could imagine Chicago as a city of life and a city where building a bright future remained possible despite the hardships. So thank you very much.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm Natalia. It's a pleasure to be here and tell you a little bit about my thesis work. Can you hear me? Or is this better? This is better. Okay. All right. So I work in a lab that studies psychiatric phenotypes or traits like anxiety, fear, and drug abuse. And today I'll be telling you about my thesis work. I'm in my third year of graduate school, and it's the second year in my lab. So I'm still in the midst of things. I won't show you a whole lot of data, but hopefully the background will be interesting. I'm going to start by discussing a couple of different approaches our lab uses to study behavioral genetics in mice. And then I'll talk a little bit about methamphetamine and its effects on the brain. And then I'll show you just one slide of preliminary data that attempts to answer the question of whether or not mice prefer methamphetamine over saline. So first, you might remember from your college days at UChicago that DNA is comprised of 4 nucleotide bases, which pair together to form a double helix structure. And the specific sequence of those bases encodes the information necessary to create an entire organism. And that functional information is passed down from parents to offspring. If you were to compare 2 different individuals from a single species, you'd probably find that by and large their DNA sequences were pretty much the same. But there is variation in the DNA sequence. Among the 2.7 billion base pairs in the mouse genome, there are a number of variant bases or mutations whose positions in the genome are known. The same is true for humans, except humans have 3.1 billion base pairs. And so the question that plagues geneticists, or the question that we really want to answer, is how does genetic variation influence behavior, disease, and other traits that make us unique from one another? There are 2 ways that our lab uses to try to answer this question, and so the one that you're most familiar with is the reverse genetic approach. So an example of that would be like making a mutant mouse, a transgenic animal, or something like that. Typically, these types of experiments are driven by a hypothesis. So you would have some idea about a specific gene that's involved in your trait of interest, and you would go in, do some genetic engineering, and try to study that gene within the context of the organism. But that's not always practical for behavioral traits and psychiatric traits where you really have no idea what's going on. So in that case, a forward genetics approach is more appropriate, and this is the approach that I'm using in my thesis work. It's a hypothesis-free method. It's essentially a statistical method. So you're looking genome-wide at all of the mutations in the sequence that are known, and you look for correlations between those mutations and your trait of interest. So what I mean by that is that these mutations in the DNA sequence can be used as sort of molecular landmarks so that you can identify the same region of DNA in a bunch of different genetically unique individuals. So as an example, suppose that these are the DNA sequences along a pair of chromosomes for 3 different mice in some population. And we know that at these 4 loci, individuals vary. So at locus 1 and 2, they tend to have either a G nucleotide or a C nucleotide. At locus 3, they have an ART, and at 4, they have an ARC, and so on and so on. So what we can do is use the presence of a G or a C at locus 2 to represent the region spanning from locus 1 to locus 3, because we know the specific genomic context in which that mutation occurs. Similarly, we can use the presence of an A or a T at locus 3 to represent the sequence between locus 2 and locus 4, and so on, all along the chromosome. So let's suppose that I've measured the weight of the prefrontal cortex in a large sample of mice. In reality, I'm testing 1,000 mice, and I'm not actually measuring this phenotype, but it's a convenient example. So suppose I do that, and I've grouped my mice into 3 different categories. Some of them have heavy brains, some of them have medium-sized brains, and some of them have light brains. And I'm showing you one mouse from each of those groups. And so I would go all along the genome, and at each mutation I would ask is, if I group mice according to their genotype at this locus, will they fall into the same pattern as they did when I grouped them by the weight of their cortex? And so in most cases, say you're testing 1,000 mutations across the entire genome, this won't be true. But suppose I come to locus 3 and I say, okay, it looks like individuals with an AA genotype have heavier cortexes and the heterozygous individuals, which have heavier cortexes than the TT genotype. And so then I might say, okay, great, somewhere in this region of DNA, there's a gene that's influencing cortex weight. I should say it's never as simple as this. It would be wonderful if it were, but I'm not going to get into the complexities of genetic mapping. I think you get the basic idea of what we try to do. The thing that I like about mice is that they're very easy to measure phenotypes in, especially compared to humans. And so they're actually very well suited for forward genetic studies. Some of the advantages are, you can control the environment that the mouse is living in. You can't really control the environment of humans that are coming in for behavioral testing. They have short generation times. They're a lot less expensive, and they're convenient in a lot of ways than humans. Another thing that makes them advantageous is that we have access to all of these different tissues in mice that are obviously inaccessible in humans. So for example, I can dissect brain regions out of my mice and study gene expression in those tissues. So I can look and see if the genes that are turned on in mice that really like methamphetamine are different from the ones that don't. So this is sort of just a laundry list of all of the things that I'm phenotyping in my mice. The traits that I'm most interested in are the behavioral ones. So I'm measuring a couple of different behavioral responses to methamphetamine, which I'll talk about in a minute. Locomotor, moving around activity, which is why I have this ridiculous picture up right here, and a number of physiological traits like body weight, blood glucose levels, and those sorts of things, which we're doing in collaboration with researchers around the world. All right, let's talk about methamphetamine. Methamphetamine abuse is widespread and problematic. The National Institute on Drug Abuse estimated that about 13 million people ages 12 and up have abused methamphetamine in their lifetimes. And in 2010, over 350,000 of those individuals, or not those individuals, but 350,000 people were currently using methamphetamine. And the reason for this is probably because of the profound effects that methamphetamine has on the brain's reward circuit. And so when I say reward circuit, I mean basically a system of neurons, dopaminergic neurons in particular, that connect structures like the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the striatum, all three of which have been repeatedly and consistently linked to drug abuse, the experience of pleasure, motor coordination, and things like that. Specifically, methamphetamine increases the levels of dopamine in the synapse, or in the space between neurons. What it does, dopamine is the yellow particle, and methamphetamine is the orange one. So methamphetamine mimics dopamine, and it pushes the dopamine out of its little vesicles into this cell. Then dopamine is then free to exit the cell and bind to its receptors in the synapse. This overstimulates the cells and creates an intense feeling of pleasure and reward. Other effects of methamphetamine include increased breathing, increased heart rate, locomotor activation, and a decrease in appetite. So although methamphetamine can create these very potent and reliable responses, this feeling of reward, the experience of reward itself is a natural process that we all experience when we enjoy a good meal or when we spend time with someone that we like. And so this process is well characterized. Like over time, the experience of reward is assigned value, and cues that predict that reward tend to be liked. So when you hear a phone call, you're excited because you're going to hear from your girl or your guy, whatever. In the case of a drug user, maybe the environment associated with taking the drug would tend to be liked. And one becomes motivated to obtain that rewarding experience again, and actions associated with obtaining the reward tend to be repeated. So this sort of process is really important in the context of drug abuse, since drugs are chemicals and they elicit these potent responses. Unfortunately for me, addiction is extremely complicated, and it's influenced by a number of genetic and non-genetic factors, as I've tried to depict here. It's very difficult to choose one of these phenotypes to study in mice, particularly because addiction doesn't really exist in mice. Mice don't take drugs on their own, so what am I supposed to do? I've chosen to focus on drug liking, or the subjective response to acute administration of a drug. We know that humans vary in their response to drugs. We know that variance is heritable from parents to children. And we know that the same is true for rodents. And so what I'm hoping to do, or what my hypothesis is that individuals who tend to like drugs are probably more likely to go on to use them again and potentially abuse them. Some of the people who go on to abuse them are more likely to become addicted to drugs, and we know that this correlation exists in humans from epidemiological studies. By focusing on the initial stages of drug use, I also hope to identify genes that would inform strategies to prevent addiction rather than just treating addiction. Another thing I like about the drug liking phenotype is that we can actually measure it using the same paradigm in humans and in mice, which makes the results a lot easier to interpret, hopefully. That paradigm is called the conditioned place preference paradigm, or CPP. CPP is basically the tendency for an animal or a human to spend more time in an environment that's been paired with a rewarding drug. And so this is the assay that takes up most of my time right now. It's an 8-day test, and on the first day, I take a mouse and then give it a saline injection, and I place it into this box. It looks exactly like this, except on the first day, the divider is flipped so that the mouse can explore both sides of the chamber, which are delineated by both visual cues and tactile cues, so the floors are made of different textures. And it's sort of allowed to roam free. A computer measures all of its movements, and we record their preference for either side of the box. It's usually around 50-50 on both sides. On the second and the fourth days of the experiment, the animal is given an injection of methamphetamine, except this time the divider is turned over, like in the picture, and they're only allowed to explore the left side of the chamber. On days 3 and 5, they get an injection of saline, but this time they're only allowed to explore the right side of the chamber. So they associate one context with a drug and one context with saline. And then after a couple days, we test them again with the divider turned around so that they can access both sides. And we measure their preference for the side that was paired with the rewarding drug. It might seem like a stretch to call the amount of time they're spending on the drug-paired side their preference or drug liking, but in humans, self-reported liking of a drug is actually predictive of conditioned place preference. And this was done in a lab in the psychiatry department, Harriet DeWitt's lab. And she didn't put humans in a box or anything like that, but she did give them amphetamine, oral administration of amphetamine, and basically did the same experiment except with 2 small rooms with different artwork around. And the same result sort of happened. So the humans tended to prefer the room that was paired with the drug, and they also reported liking the drug. So we have reason to believe that this assay is actually accessing the rewarding properties of the drug and isn't just measuring locomotor activity. My preliminary results also suggest that. So I'm showing you their initial preference for the drug-paired side on the left, and it's about 51.5% over a course of 30 minutes, so like 50-50. But on the final day, they're spending about 56.5% on the drug-paired side. And that might not seem like a lot, but this is an average over 457 mice, and it's highly significant. So my hope is that I can look at animals who really, really prefer methamphetamine and animals that are sort of aversive to it and see if there are any genetic differences between those individuals. So I'd like to end by acknowledging my lab mates. If you're interested in our research, you can check out palmerlab.org. This is my thesis committee, and thank you guys for listening.
So thank you again to all 4 of you. I mean, I think just in that last hour, you get a sense of the breadth of projects that are going on campus, but I think also some of the interesting overlaps in the projects. I mean, you know, drug addiction is obviously a problem in Chicago. Chicago has multiple problems related to cultural awareness and cultural education. Evo splashes are everywhere, so that just runs across all of these things. I wanted to kick off questions, and we want to take your questions with kind of something related to that question of interdisciplinary conversations at the university. Do they happen very often, and like, what is the actual usefulness of this? I mean, does Natalia's project actually speak to you, Kai, or you know, how do these conversations either enhance or change, or maybe it's just nice to get out of the box once in a while, out of your, not the mouse box, but get out of your lab and and into other places. It doesn't have to be this like profound, this is how the work affects me, but I'd be curious as students and postdocs here, how these kinds of conversations inform your own work. And I'll take the mic, and so if you have a question, just raise a hand and I'll bring it to you.
Well, Kai and I actually know each other through the Urban Doctoral Fellows program, which is an interdisciplinary urban studies fellowship program that's been running for this entire year. And I personally found that very exciting because it's both interdisciplinary but with a purpose. I mean, obviously we're all working on urban studies issues, so we can come together around a shared interest but bring different disciplinary perspectives to it. And I personally, have learned so much about the methodologies used by other disciplines. I've learned a lot about cities, obviously, and what's going on in ways that have really enriched me as a scholar. For example, just yesterday, I haven't taken a math class since I was 16, but I learned all about quantitative methods in sociology that were being used to study race in education, which is something I'm really interested in. So I think in my experience, as long as interdisciplinary things are with a purpose, they have some kind of shared thread, it's not completely random, that it can be extremely, extremely valuable.
Yeah, the interdisciplinary discussions here, I think, are very, very eye-opening, and they can really expand the range of scholarship that you can do and the different issues that you can work on. And actually, in particularly, Meredith and I were just talking recently, and in my research on Black Chicago, there's this group that I want to study that was this group of activists in the middle of the 20th century that were interested in participating in the civil rights movement, and they were all black, or they were mostly black actually, and they identified themselves with the Unitarian Universalist group, but their minister of music was the Jewish liturgical composer Max Janowski at KAM Isaiah Israel. And so Meredith and I were talking about ways in which we could combine our focuses and try to figure out what was going on with this group and why they had this kind of unique combination of cultural influences and cultural practices and what that was doing for them politically. So there's all kinds of different things that we as emerging scholars can study interdisciplinarily that we wouldn't really be able to do without the kinds of interdisciplinary conversations that are going on here.
So I can give one nice example. So about half a year ago, I think October 2012, there was a conference here in Chicago organized between architects and physicists. So usually they don't talk to each other, architects and physicists. Because, well, I don't know what architects are actually doing, and they don't know so much about physics. But there was a combined conference, and so we found out. So we are very interested in materials, how they behave, and architects are, of course, also interested in all kinds of materials, and especially how to use them to make buildings which have different properties than buildings that are making now. Like, for example, those suspensions that I showed, they have different properties than normal materials that we're using now. And they're looking at how can we use those things, are there special properties which are very useful in some buildings. In that way there are a lot of unexpected collaborations between completely different groups of people.
In the field of genetics, collaboration between disciplines is, I think, necessary at this point. In the human genetics department, I mean, we're half statisticians. We couldn't do our work without statisticians, and so I've learned a lot of statistics and a little bit of computer programming since I've joined the Palmer Lab. My boss is also, in addition to being a geneticist, he's also co-listed in the neuroscience department or in the neurobiology department, and so there's crosstalk between neuroscientists and geneticists as well. We have a neuroscience grad student in our lab. And it's all really helpful to sort of see the big picture of the problems that you're looking at them from different perspectives and gaining insight into what's really going on. Like it's easy to sort of get lost in the statistics and in the genetics, but it's nice to be able to go across the lab and talk to a neuroscientist about what could actually be happening functionally. As far as the humanities go, I think I haven't communicated with my friends in the humanities as much as I should have, but I'm really interested. I majored in biology and religion, so I have a wide range of interests, and it's nice to hear like what you guys are doing and stuff. Those sort of events aren't publicized, I think, across disciplines enough, and it would be nice to know more about about the research that's going on. So,
I have a comment and a question. It's very interesting. I'm from New York, and I have friends who are very seriously interested in the lack of appreciation of classical music among young adults today. And one of the things that this gentleman I'm thinking of is trying to do is to give money to the New York City Department of Education to bring music education. And you said it, and I know what you're saying in terms of kids and leadership and all that, but there's another very interesting point, especially for University of Chicago graduate, and that is love of music that is disappearing without the music education. And I wondered, well, I know it's not part of your thesis, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention and let you think about it a little and tell you what's being done on the East Coast in terms of this, purely by volunteers.
I appreciate that a lot. Actually, part of some of the questions I was posing are like, why do we ask arts education to achieve these other goals, and why does it seem to be, why do considerations of music or arts for their own sake seem to be excluded from these debates? So it's something I'm very interested in, because from my perspective, like, yes, the arts can do all these other things, possibly, but fundamentally they're something that people should learn about because it's something that is part of our culture. And I wish that we had enough funding for that. So, but unfortunately, I think strategically people need to make other kinds of arguments in order to get funding for the arts. So it's a complicated question, and it has a lot to do with the value that our society places on learning the arts as opposed to learning other things. So.
Hi, I'm here for my 40th reunion I graduated from the college, and I wanted to ask how often are people, you yourself and other graduate students mixing to share your research? Because my impression 40 years ago was that graduate school was a very alienating and lonely place to be, while the undergraduates were sort of all in this bubble of fun, if I can say it. But more, we had more activities to mix and lascivious ball and stuff like that. But that the graduate student community was kind of left on their own. Do you have is this a regular thing you guys do? And do you have other ways of meeting people outside of your own disciplines? And, is it getting friendlier, I guess?
Be honest.
Within the biological sciences, they try to sort of organize social events for us. So there are student groups. One of the ones that I've participated in is it's like a graduate student minority group, just for all of the students to sort of come together because there aren't a whole lot of us. And we've had like potlucks and barbecues, just really informal events, unrelated to our work, and that's really nice. I don't participate in them as much as often as I could, I think, because I just get immersed in what I'm doing. But yeah, there are some things like that. Of course, like the university-wide things I'm not aware of. I don't know if you guys are, but within the biological sciences, it seems to be okay.
In our department, in the music department, we have the Graduate Music Society, whose only goal is to facilitate socializing amongst students. We also have an informal organization called the Get Your Life Together Club, where we help each other with life issues and things that might come up. But it is more difficult to meet people in other departments. That's why I value, like I said, this urban studies program I'm in. because it's provided a structured, like a semi-structured way to do that. But otherwise, I mean, you could go to workshops in other departments. You could, like if you attend events regularly, I guess you could meet people. But it's just so hard to have the time to do that in my experience. So personally, most of the people I know who are very far from my discipline are people I knew before I came here, who I went to college with or something, who are now like at Booth or med school or whatever. But mostly I just know people who do things close to what I do, which is maybe unfortunate. Maybe it's just a natural consequence of being busy. But
Yeah, I agree with those points. And there are also other interdisciplinary workshops. If there's a workshop focusing on race, culture, and politics. There's other urban workshops focused on city, society, and space. There's area-oriented workshops, such as a Latin American and Caribbean workshop. So those are those are meetings where people can workshop what they're working on and have feedback from different disciplines. And those are probably the main areas in which people can get that kind of interdisciplinary feedback. And then sometimes those workshops can then lead to social relationships outside of the academic setting. But there could definitely be more settings like this for that kind of interdisciplinary discussion.
Yeah, so in the physics department, I honestly don't know if there's anything really organized that we meet other departments. But I think a lot of these things just happen by chance. So, for example, so my professor, his wife is an artist, so we get involved in all kinds of art things. So a lot of our people can be regularly found in the Logan Art Center. But yeah, I don't know anything which is really organized in such way.
Two more questions.
This is directed for Mr. Parker. I know that when I was here in the late 60s, and also I was associated till about the early 80s with the university, the question of admissions, minority admissions, was always a big factor. And usually, the percentage was somewhere around 5 to 7%. So my question is, one, what is the situation today? Has the University of Chicago reached 10% African American enrollment? And two, can you give a sense of the history department? Is the history department really engaged in this concept of studying African American culture in Chicago, let's say, from 1950 to the present?
That's a great question. The University of Chicago certainly has a reputation for not being necessarily at the forefront of racial comity in terms of even in relation to some of the other its peer institutions. But I think that recently they've begun to make a lot of strides in that area in admissions. I'm not sure exactly what the percentages are, but my understanding is that there's been increased enrollment from the time that you're talking about. And I think recently they had the third highest percentage of African American incoming students that they'd had. So it's getting better in that regards, I think. And in terms of the history department, there's definitely a lot of interest in studying the history of African Americans in Chicago from the middle of the century to the present. My main advisor, Adam Green, published a book on the subject, Selling the Race, Culture, and Community in Black Chicago from 1940 to 1955. And he talks a lot about efforts to build community, not just locally, but also nationally within Chicago. And there's other scholars who are also working on Chicago. Matthew Briones works on the relationship between African Americans and Japanese Americans in Chicago in the middle of the century, and the different political vistas that were kind of imagined and reached for at that time. And throughout the university, I think that there's been an effort to use Chicago as a site to really investigate various issues of race and of integration and racial equality as Meredith and other scholars are doing. And also a lot of recent PhD students have been studying this issue. We just had Marsha Walker just graduated a year ago, and she did her dissertation on Addie Wyatt, who was this reverend in Chicago who really combined the issues of civil rights, labor, and women's rights in a way that few activists really did. And actually, she just presented this exhibit at the Vivian G. Harsh Collection of Afro-American History and Literature that really garnered a lot of attention, and it opened with this great celebration of Addie Wyatt, and Jesse Jackson was there, and these other figures. So I think the university really is making a very strong contribution towards the study of African American history in Chicago from the middle of the 20th century to the present, and it's a very important a contribution to be made, particularly since Chicago really is the center of black politics in a very unique way, not only with the election of Barack Obama, but even historically being one of the real linchpins of the New Deal coalition and things of that nature. So it's a very important history, and it's great that the university is really focusing a lot of attention on excavating that history, particularly since a lot of it has been lost. The Pilgrim Baptist Church, where Thomas Dorsey was the director of music, burned down several years ago, and the records were completely incinerated, and that was a real tragic loss for African American history. So it's important that this work gets done as quickly and as dutifully as possible, I think. So.
I just want to say that I came from New York, and then I've been living here permanently for about 30 years, and really, you don't get a view on the East Coast that of the centrality of Chicago. There's a new book out called The Third Coast, which is really showing all of the things in mid-century Chicago that were exported, that other people, the East Coast picked up on, whatever, entertainment, whatever. Chicago is really, central. I really think Chicago is really central now. And could you tell me, where's this Vivian Marshall Library?
Oh, it's at 95th and Halsted. So it's at the end of the of the once and future red line.
Slowly being reconstructed. Well, I think with that answer, can we just give another round of applause to our panelists? Thank you to all of you for being part of this inaugural capstone event of this series. We promise there will be more of them next year, since you guys seem to actually enjoy it. They'll hopefully be monthly going forward from now on. Join us for some wine. Take a bottle if you want. And enjoy your time here. Thank you again.